Okay. Today, my guest is Professor Mary Teagarden. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Mary as a person. Professor Teagarden is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally, is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Teagarden is the Associate Dean of Faculty at Thunderbird. She's also the editor-in-chief of Thunderbird International Business Review and an editor at JIBS. She's an expert in global strategic human resource management. She's an active international consultant on technology-intensive manufacturing and service firms in China, India, Malaysia, and Brazil. Mary has published more than 130 articles, books, chapters, and case studies. She has lived and worked in 11 Latin American, 5 European, and 8 Asian countries, in addition to the US and Canada. Mary regularly contributes to international media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Fox Business, ABC, NBC, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and International Health Tribune. And most interestingly, in her spare time, Mary explores deserts of the Southwest and does rock climbing in her Jeep. And that sets the bar so high for coolness. I hope we can talk about it later. Thank you, Mary, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Definitely my pleasure.
The first question always is, what did you want to become when you were a child?
When I was a child, I wanted to become a scientist.
In what area?
I didn't have it nailed down an area, but I was leaning toward chemistry or physics.
Chemistry, physics. And can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus international?
My dad was a military attaché, and I grew up outside of the US. So from a very young age, I recall when I was in kindergarten in Haiti, I was the only non-Black child in the class. But that wasn't the difference I noticed. All of my friends spoke French. So at home I spoke English, and at school I spoke French. And that was when I really realized, there are differences. I was very young.
And what made you choose IB as a research area?
I kind of fell into it. I started out to study technology transfer, and Dean Herberger at the time at USC said to me, why don't you think about international business? It's an up and coming field. It's a hot field. And at the time I wanted to do field work, and I studied tech transfer between the US and China. And there was no other place in the world where you could get any scale looking at that topic at the time. And so I backed into it. I'm fluent in Spanish. I studied China. I had to learn Chinese to do my dissertation.
Really? Did you learn Chinese? Can you speak Chinese now?
Not well.
No. What's something not many people know about you, something that you wouldn't put on your CV?
I've been married for 53 years.
Congratulations.
I have the most wonderful husband in the world, and most people don't realize that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would be your second best alternative career path?
I would have had to start a long time ago, but I would have become a physician. And that I was at a tipping point, and I could go one path or the other. And I took first chemistry, and that took me to a point where I decided I did not like doing that kind of work. I went back for an MBA. I loved what my professors were doing. So I went for my Ph.D.
Wow. Let's talk about regrets. If you've got any, what is one thing you wish you would have done that you didn't?
I wish I would have spent more time writing. But the challenge is there are only 24 hours in a day, and you have to carve some out for sleep. I didn't have enough time in any one day to write as much as I would like to have written.
Oh, you've written a lot. You've accomplished a lot. What about failure? What did you learn from failure? What was your biggest failure?
Um, that's a hard one for me to answer. I think it would have been that I did not start my studies early enough. I left with a bachelor's degree in chemistry to work as a chemist for several years in work that I didn't enjoy. And that sidetracked me. So I was 34 before I got my Ph.D.
That was still young. I mean, yeah,
I could have been 27 or 26.
I see. What are you most proud of?
What I'm most proud of is when there was a lead paint crisis with Mattel in their toys. I was interviewed by the Financial Times about it, and that came to the attention of the US Congress, and I was asked to come in and testify about lead paint in toys. It was all about supply chains and where the responsibility lies. And my concluding remarks were, what China did was legal and in China, and the importer has responsibility. But what breaks my heart about the situation is Chinese children still have lead paint in their toys. 2 years later, the Chinese government changed that, changed the legislation around lead paint in toys. And I was told by several high-level officials it was because of that testimony. That's the thing I'm most proud of.
You should be proud of that. It's very direct impact.
There aren't many of us that have a real impact on humanity, and I'm proud of that. So thank you.
Great. What are you most passionate about?
I'm really passionate about social justice. I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and a lot of time working with disenfranchised communities in Arizona. I've done that probably forever, but that's probably my real passion.
Perfect. And we got a little bit of time left in the personal segment. Can we talk about your Jeep and how you do rock climbing?
Sure. It's a lifted Rubicon, and we go out. There are lots of places in the desert that have steep hills and rocks that you can go over, and so you just go up. I'm so short that I can't see over the hood. So when we're doing the steep areas, I ask my husband to drive, or my husband does drive. But,
how long have you been doing it?
Oh, probably 25 years.
Wow. Any accidents?
No.
Nothing. Safe?
We're relatively cautious. We know when to stop.
Perfect. Wow. I mean, you set the bar for coolness so high with that anecdote. Perfect. Thanks. Okay, let's switch to research. Now, imagine you're stranded in a small village. You sought refuge in this small neighborhood pub. So you're talking to people who don't regularly read your work. How do you explain what you do? Why is it important to the general public?
I start out by telling people I'm a teacher. And I'm a teacher who tries to find answers to questions that are important to some people. And then when they ask about the research side, which they're much more interested in the teacher side, I've had to do this quite a few times. But when they ask about the research side, I give them some very basic examples of some of the kinds of things that I have studied.
For instance, what do you say?
I talk about how business people do business in other countries. And then if I bore down more, I say, for example, I look at China, and that means I talk to a lot of Chinese business people. I talk to a lot of foreign business people working in China. And then I think about what I learned, and then I turn it into information that can be used by business people in China, both Chinese and foreign.
Perfect. Mary, in your opinion, what are the omitted variables, a few of the omitted variables in IB research, or areas that we haven't studied enough?
I think some of the areas that we have not studied nearly enough is context. And the context matters. And many people in IB point out that context is what differentiates us from other fields, from our more basic fields like management and finance. Yet we don't explain context adequately in most of our articles. We tend to stay with unidimensional type characteristics, number of people in the country kind of things, as opposed to social interactions. What we miss is the complexity in international business. We don't describe the complexity or the nested layers of context in our work. We also bring a lot of our personal biases into studying context. And especially when we do studies across domains, that really matters. I have had having the benefit of speaking multiple languages. I understand that the thought process in different languages varies significantly. In English, I say, I dropped a pen. In Spanish, I say, that pen fell from me. Two different mindsets. It's a simple example, but that's one I use often. We really don't necessarily capture meaning in our constructs. The other piece is we need more methodological innovation. We tend to rely on the tools that we already know, and we solve the problem the same way others solve the problem, because that's what gets into our journals and that's what gets published. I'd really hope that we can move more toward mixed methods, where we look at multiple layers in a country, in a research, in a study, in an organization, and that we use different ways of knowing to kind of test ourselves regarding, is what we're doing good? Is it good science? Remember, I'm a chemist from way back. And worked for years as a scientist.
Mary, can we talk about creativity? For example, what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity? Then how does it lead to creative papers, creative questions?
When I'm wandering, when my mind's wandering, I'm looking out at a panorama of the desert out of my windows here. I have a whole wall of windows. When my mind wanders, I think about relationships of animals to nature, animals to people, some plants to other plants. And that takes my mind out to when I'm doing research, what is the nature of all of the connections that surround that research? And for me, looking at not being afraid of complexity, putting my biases on the table, appreciating that there are multi-tiered systems that we're dealing with, I think produces more creative and more relevant research.
Where do you see the IB research in the next 5 to 10 years? What's the next big question?
I think we might see more interface, more transdisciplinary research, more interface between organizations and governments, regulations. And I think the unfortunate COVID situation is taking us in that direction. What is the role of government in influencing business? What is the role of business in influencing government? That's where I think we'll see some breakthroughs with transdisciplinary research.
I haven't sent this to you earlier, but in the interviews, there is this underlying theme coming up in the research segment about increased nationalism or increasing trends towards nationalism versus globalization. What's your prediction? Which one is going to be gaining more salience over the next
decade? Nationalism. Next millennium, globalization. When I look at it right now, we've swung to an extreme. And if you study through history, when a society or when societies, because it's not just a US phenomenon, it's global, when societies go to extremes, they move back toward the center, but they go to the opposite extreme, and then they come back to a midpoint or a equilibrium. And right now, I think we're living in a very difficult time. One of the things that we really try to do at Thunderbird in our education is to bring these pieces together, kind of help heal the fragmentation that is happening because of the extreme we're in right now. But I'm an optimist. I'm very hopeful. It can't last for long. I don't think it'll last my lifetime. So,
okay. From your window, how did the culture of IB scholarship change or evolve over time? What did we lose? What did we gain along the path?
When IB broke away from our traditional functional areas, and it would be economics was probably the first place to see a major break. But when it broke away, we had scholars who were fighting to prove that they were legitimate, that the area was legitimate and that the scholars were legitimate. And at the time, it was very difficult to publish in international anything in journals. So it was a really fight for legitimacy. And across time, we've evolved. I'm old enough to remember Gibbs when Gibbs was not highly regarded. And now it has one of the highest impact factors of any journal. And so we've overcome the we are legitimate scientists battle. And what we have moved to is one that we're taken seriously, but I don't think we take what we study seriously enough. I think we don't look for relevance. And for me, relevance is very important. And by relevance, I mean, I always ask the question, does what we do matter for practice? Because we are an applied science. And that's one of the things that kind of keeps me awake at night. And we tend to move away from that relevance because it's not rewarded in our journals. It's not rewarded in our tenure and promotion systems. Unless I'm your dean. It's rewarded.
True. So let's talk about the relevance. How do you, or what do you suggest that we do or people in the field could do to make things more relevant, more important, and make relevance more legitimate?
When I look at relevance, I think any study that I have done in my career has a starting point.
Mhm.
What do managers need to know? What are their pain points? What are the problems that need to be solved?
Mhm.
And part of what the ability we have as scholars is to keep that as our focal point, but to come up and look at what do we know already? What theories inform what we're doing? And then translate back down to the practitioner. So that lead paint story, I knew
Very
all
powerful
kinds of
story.
theory about value chains. I knew a lot about import export. And I took that to deconstruct what went on with the debacle around lead paint. And I was able to inform practice, here's what you need to do. And I was able to write a couple of articles that influence the way we look at supply chains. We scholars look at supply chains.
Last question in the research segment. Well, what did we overly study? Maybe we should move away from.
What do we overstudy? Oh, we spend way too much time on some things like local, global, the Bartlett and Goschal tensions. I think we know enough there to inform what we do. And most of the studies, for example, in that area, seem to be very minutely significant. Not that it's not good work, but we know about it. That would be one example of something we study too much.
Perfect. Now the mentoring advice segment. What was the best advice you received when you were going through the program?
When I was going through the program, the best advice I received was from Warren Bennis, who was a leadership professor. I was his RA for a while, and he said, Mary, follow your bliss. Follow what you want to do, and don't let the context force you into something you don't want to do. And that's enabled me to say no to a whole lot of things I know I don't want to do. It's guided the choice of schools I've gone to. Both. I was at San Diego State for a long time because when I interviewed, they said, oh, study anything you want. Well, that was the answer I wanted. And I came to Thunderbird because I can follow my passion in international 100%, and it's embraced. And the other schools I interviewed at weren't so hot on international. I've been here a long time.
Did you realize that there was something that, what do you wish you would know when you were starting out, that it would save you a lot of time and efforts?
I wish I had known that focusing on shorter term studies gets you published faster. All of my research is longitudinal research, takes a long time to execute. And I didn't appreciate at the time that that's a choice that will limit your choices as a scholar.
True. What's the most valuable lesson you have learned, either doing these big projects, consulting? What did you learn along the way?
The biggest lesson I learned is when you're talking and interviewing somebody and trying to collect data, all you have to do is look over your glasses and say, that's very interesting. Tell me more. Even if you're not interested, they'll spill their guts.
Okay. Well, I think we're doing fine, so I'm not going to do that. But
Okay.
what type of skills should the PhD students and junior faculty be aiming to hone in on? What are the tools that they need to perfect in the new IB era? Um, is there a specific
Can you
techniques?
say that one more, please?
What are the type of skills,
Can you,
tools that
for
they need to develop?
the tools that I think our newer graduates need are certainly the ability to analyze and incorporate context into their research.
Mhm.
And I think they need to be highly skilled in both quantitative and qualitative methods. And when I say that, I look at qualitative studies usually as the launch pad for deep understanding of a phenomenon that you can generalize. For example, you do a case study, and from that you develop a more quantitative study to capture a much larger sample. And that's the progression I like to see. And those are the skill sets I hope to see in new graduates. I also hope to see the ability to execute transdisciplinary work.
Mhm.
I always joke that you should be able to walk on two legs. When we become specialists, we learn narrow and deep. And I think we need to spread that out a little bit.
I mean, you were an editor. You are an editor. You've seen many young scholars submit papers. You've seen many of the mistakes. What are the top 3 mistakes that you see young scholars, PhD students do that they should avoid?
The first mistake that I see is they don't frame the work adequately. They don't begin their papers by establishing why what this study is about is important and why it's relevant.
Mhm.
The second mistake I see is they don't adequately ground their research in the literature. I can't tell you how many studies I've had to, how many papers I've desk rejected because I know that there is a 50-foot pile of good literature that should be cited on the topic, and it's not cited. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is after they execute the study and they don't talk about the gaps. Here are the gaps that the study exposes.
Mhm.
And here are the deficiencies in my own study. Those are the pieces that I see young scholars and older scholars too missing the point. I'm not going to hang it on just the young scholars. I probably, in the Thunderbird Journal, I probably reject 5 articles a day
Wow.
because they're just not ready for publication. So tips that I would give to scholars: after you write your paper, get a friendly review from someone who you know and trust. And if English isn't your first language, get it proofread by somebody who has English as a first language. If you're going to a US journal, if you're going to a French journal, do the same thing in French,
Mhm.
and so forth.
Uh, I'm out of questions. Mary, what is one question that I should have asked you but didn't?
Much more about my personal life.
Okay. Can I ask more about your personal life?
Sure. As I say, I've been married. I've had the wonderful benefit of having 2 boys. One is a COO in an IT company, and we lost the other one when he was 18.
Sorry.
But they're still very alive in my heart. And I have 2 grandchildren. They're both in college now. And when they started college, they were all wishy-washy. They didn't know what they wanted to study. And 2 years in and 3 years in, I have 2 finance majors on my hands. There you go. That was a transformation.
Mary, I'm going to add one more question.
Sure.
What's the secret? What's the secret for a long, happy marriage, like for 53 years? There must be something.
Marry your best friend. We've remained friends through 53 years. We're absolutely close friends first, and then all the other stuff second. And if you disagree on something, put it on the table and talk about it. And if you have high regard and respect for the other person, even if you disagree with them, you'll reach a good conclusion.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for your time. I
You're
learned a
very
lot.
welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thanks.
Take care.